The air in the room crackled, not with anger, but with a suffocating kind of pity that felt worse than any shouting match. It was a peculiar stillness that had settled upon them, a heavy blanket woven from concern and something else, something more complex that I suspected was a quiet triumph they were too polite to voice. They looked at me, my entire immediate family, my mother, her brow perpetually furrowed in a gentle, almost habitual worry. My father, his gaze steady but tinged with a familiar paternal disappointment. My younger sister Sarah, her usual vivacity muted, a faint shadow of her usual self, and my brother Mark, his golden boy aura somehow dimmed, as if even his inherent success couldn't quite override the prevailing mood. Their faces, a tapestry of hushed emotions, conveyed a singular, unshakable truth. It was the kind of look you bestow upon someone who has just irrevocably stumbled, who has made a monumental, irreversible mistake. The kind that, with a soft, weary sigh embedded in its very gaze, implies, "Well, that's that, isn't it?" The unspoken finality hung in the air, a tangible weight pressing down. They'd always pigeonholed me, neatly tucked me into a role I'd never explicitly chosen but had, for years, worn without protest. I was the compliant one, the peacekeeper, the one whose primary function seemed to be smoothing over rough edges, absorbing criticism without complaint, and ensuring a placid surface for the family's often turbulent emotional waters. My younger sister Sarah was the fiery one, the sun around which the family's attention orbited, her dramas, her triumphs, her setbacks, all equally captivating. My brother Mark was the golden boy, the effortless achiever, the one whose path seemed perpetually paved with success and quiet admiration. And me? I was simply there, the silent architect, the invisible glue that held the disparate pieces together, the constant, unassuming presence. And it turned out, the only one who hadn't fully grasped that the vase had not merely been chipped, but utterly shattered. It began subtly, as these seismic shifts in family dynamics invariably do. A slow erosion of attention, a gradual reprioritization of affections that, in retrospect, had been underway for some time. My parents, whose lives had always been so intrinsically tied to the perception of others, to the careful curation of neighborly approval, began to subtly, almost imperceptibly, shift their focus. Sarah's latest drama, whether it was a career setback that sent her spiraling or a relationship woe that consumed her, became the undeniable centerpiece of every family dinner. Her narratives, fraught with emotion and immediate crises, commanded the spotlight, eclipsing any semblance of normalcy. Mark's achievements, of course, were always a given, a steady, reassuring hum of quiet pride, an expectation met rather than an event to be savored. I, on the other hand, had reached a point of quiet contentment, a comfortable plateau. My job offered stability, my small apartment was a haven of personal peace, and my long-term relationship, while not overtly flamboyant, was a source of deep, abiding happiness. Nothing dramatic, nothing to cause a ripple, nothing, in their increasingly narrow definition of importance, worth discussing. And in their world, if it wasn't dramatic, if it didn't demand immediate attention, it simply didn't register. The true inflection point, the moment when the subtle currents began to surge into a visible wave, was when I started to assert myself just a little. It wasn't a rebellion, not a sudden explosive act of defiance. It was more akin to the quiet dawning of a forgotten truth. I had a voice, and perhaps, just perhaps, it was worth using. I had always been the one to volunteer for the thankless tasks, the domestic footnotes of family life, picking up the dry cleaning when everyone else was rushing, meticulously organizing holiday gatherings, mediating the inevitable sibling squabbles with a weary but practiced hand. One Easter, a day typically steeped in tradition and my silent, dutiful presence in the kitchen, I decided with a quiet resolve that I wouldn't be the one spending my entire day orchestrating the meal while everyone else enjoyed the leisurely unfolding of the holiday. I told my mother, calmly, my voice steady despite the internal flutter of apprehension, that I would happily bring the dessert, a task I found enjoyable and manageable, but that I wouldn't be responsible for the main course. Her reaction was not one of irritation or dismissal, but of genuine, almost bewildered surprise, as if I had suddenly sprouted wings or declared allegiance to a foreign land. "Oh, but dear," she'd said, her voice laced with that familiar, patronizing sweetness that always managed to sting more than outright disapproval, "you're so good at it. And Sarah's been so stressed with work." The implication, heavy and suffocating, hung in the air, a palpably judgment. My comfort, my desire for a different kind of participation, was secondary, a minor inconvenience compared to Sarah's perceived, and often self-inflicted, stress. That was the first crack, a hairline fracture that, in hindsight, foreshadowed the larger fissures to come. Then, with the inevitability of a gathering storm, came the wedding invitations. My sister Sarah was getting married. It was the kind of lavish, meticulously planned affair that my parents, particularly my mother, had always envisioned for their firstborn daughter, a grand culmination of dreams and social aspirations. Naturally, I was expected to be a bridesmaid, a role that entailed endless dress fittings, agonizing over floral arrangements that seemed to hold the fate of the universe, and the constant unspoken expectation to play the role of the supportive, selfless sister, the quiet shadow to the bride's radiant glow. Meanwhile, Sarah was a whirlwind of demands, her fiancé, a pleasant but seemingly passive participant, serving more as a prop in her grand production than an equal partner. I found myself perpetually running errands, soothing her anxieties that seemed to bloom with every passing day, and most challenging of all, biting my tongue when she made casually insensitive remarks about my own relationship, which she invariably deemed too quiet, lacking spark, and by extension, somehow less legitimate than her own tempestuous romance. The real kicker, the moment that crystallized the injustice and the sheer breathtaking myopia of their perspective, came during the frantic machinations of wedding planning. I had, by chance, overheard my mother on the phone, confiding in a friend with a conspiratorial whisper that betrayed her deepest anxieties. She was worried, she confessed, that I might make a scene at the wedding, that beneath my calm exterior, I was a bit of a drama queen underneath it all. The irony was so thick, so potent I could almost taste it. Me, a drama queen? I was the one who had spent years, a lifetime perhaps, meticulously cleaning up everyone else's messes, absorbing their emotional fallout, and ensuring a smooth, unruffled surface for their dramas to unfold upon. The thought of me, the perennial peacekeeper, being the one to cause a scene was a grotesque distortion of reality, a testament to how little they truly saw me. The night before the wedding, amidst the orchestrated gaiety and the underlying tension, there was a rehearsal dinner. It was, by all accounts, a beautiful event, a picturesque tableau of familial joy and impending union. Yet, the undercurrent of nervous energy, of unspoken anxieties was palpable. Sarah was in one of her signature moods, her pronouncements sharp, her patience non-existent, snapping at everyone who dared to approach her with even the slightest perceived transgression. My parents, as usual, were a picture of carefully choreographed politeness, walking on eggshells, their every word and gesture calibrated to avoid any further disturbance to Sarah's fragile equilibrium. I, however, had made a decision, a quiet, internal commitment that had solidified over weeks of thoughtful deliberation. I had spent countless hours crafting a speech, not a grand, embarrassing toast designed to steal the spotlight, but something simple, heartfelt, and most importantly, honest. The moment arrived, a hush falling over the assembled guests as the toasts began to wind down. After the obligatory pronouncements from the parents and the groom's side, a customary pause, and then the MC with a nod in my direction announced, "And now, a word from the bride's sister." I stood up, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my hands surprisingly felt steady. I took a slow, deep breath, my gaze sweeping across the room, connecting with Sarah, then with my parents and finally encompassing the assembled guests, a sea of expectant faces. I began by wishing them both genuine happiness, a wish that came from a place of sincere goodwill, free from any subtext or agenda. Then I spoke, my voice clear and surprisingly strong, about the nature of true support, about how it wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, or the one who incessantly demanded the most attention, or even the one who was the most visibly distressed. It was about quiet strength, about the unwavering constancy of being present, about understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love, the most profound expression of care, is simply to listen without judgment, to be there without the need to be the center of attention, to offer solace without seeking reward. I didn't name names. I didn't point fingers. I didn't recount specific grievances or highlight particular instances of perceived slight. I simply spoke from the heart, drawing from my own lived experiences, about how I had always believed in the quiet power of kindness, the enduring strength of a steady presence, and the profound value of T.Os who consistently show up, who do what needs to be done without fanfare or expectation of accolades. I talked about how, in my observation, sometimes the most valued people in any group, any family, are the ones who don't seek external validation, the ones who simply do what needs to be done, their contributions often unseen but undeniably essential. There was a beat of profound silence, a pregnant pause that seemed to stretch into an eternity. Sarah's face was a mask of confusion, her brow furrowed in a way that suggested she was trying to decipher a foreign language. My mother's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even dawning comprehension, crossing her features. My father, characteristically, looked down at his plate, his expression unreadable, though I sensed a subtle shift in his posture. But then, something unexpected happened. A ripple of murmurs spread through the guests, a soft hum of shared sentiment. I saw a few heads nod in quiet agreement. I saw a few people exchange glances that held a flicker of recognition, of understanding, of acknowledgement. It was a subtle yet undeniable shift in the room's collective consciousness. The immediate aftermath was, as expected, a little awkward. Sarah, her composure somewhat ruffled, cornered me later, her voice tight with an almost accusatory edge, asking, "What was that supposed to mean?" I simply offered her a small, knowing smile and replied, "It meant what it sounded like, Sarah." My mother, her usual concern reasserting itself, pulled me aside, her brow furrowed, asking if I was all right, if I was perhaps feeling overlooked or unappreciated. I reassured her truthfully that I was perfectly content, more content, in fact, than I had been in a long time, now that I had articulated my own quiet truth. The real impact, however, was not in the immediate dramatic confrontations that Sarah's question might have implied. It was far more subtle, a slow, steady erosion of the old dynamics, a gradual but undeniable shift in the atmosphere. At the wedding itself, I was no longer invisible, the silent observer in the periphery. But neither was I the center of attention, a role I had never sought. Instead, people approached me, not with the familiar, pitying glances I had grown accustomed to, but with a quiet, genuine respect. Old aunts and uncles who had previously barely acknowledged my existence beyond a perfunctory nod, now engaged me in conversation, their curiosity piqued. Friends of my parents, who had always been deferential to my louder siblings, now sought me out, their smiles warm and their questions thoughtful. They spoke about how they appreciated my perspective, how they recognized the quiet strength in what I had said, how my words resonated with their own experiences. Over the next few months, the family dynamic began to transform, not with a bang, but with the gentle persistence of a rising tide. When family gatherings occurred, the conversations began to include me more genuinely, my contributions no longer an afterthought but a welcomed part of the discourse. My opinions, once dismissed or summarily overlooked, were now sought after, my insights valued. Sarah, after her initial bewilderment and a period of perhaps grudging introspection, seemed to subtly acknowledge my quiet strength. She still had her dramatic moments, her life remained a series of emotional peaks and valleys, but there was a discernible shift in how she treated me. She no longer saw me as a doormat, a silent absorbent of her woes, but as someone who wouldn't be easily pushed around, someone with her own quiet boundaries. My parents, too, seemed to finally see me, not as a role to be filled, not as the reliable helper or the unwavering peacekeeper, but as an individual with her own quiet dignity, her own internal landscape. Their conversations, once so often focused on Sarah's crises or Mark's successes, began to include my life, my thoughts, my feelings, not as an afterthought or a superficial inquiry, but as a genuine and integral part of their world. The pitying glances that had once been a familiar fixture were slowly, surely, replaced by a newfound respect, a dawning recognition that the glue that had held things together, the silent force that had maintained their family's cohesion, had also been its foundation, a strength in its own right. The impact wasn't a thunderclap, a dramatic explosion that rearranged everything in an instant. It was the gentle, persistent turning of a tide, a gradual organic shift that, in its own quiet way, left behind a shoreline of newfound understanding and a more balanced appreciation of each individual's unique contribution.